Hello, my dear students and friends. Welcome back to my class. And today, under the environmental study, we'll be discussing about the biodiversity impact assessment. That is the part of the environmental impact assessment. I am Professor Rose Ilyas, and this content has been developed by me and Dr. Iqbal Imam from the Department of Wildlife Sciences, AMU, and Aligarh. So, the goal of EIA, you all must have heard about the EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. So, what is EIA? So, the goal of the EIA is to promote environmentally sound development while balancing environmental cost and benefits. So, that is the EIA. And EIA stands for the Environmental Impact Assessment. It is process that evaluate the environmental impact of a proposed project, whether it is positive or negative. The goal of EIA is to promote environmentally sound development while balancing environmental cost and benefit. The National Environmental Management Authority, that is NEMA, National Environmental and Management Authority, is responsible for administering the environmental impact assessment. The Environmental Management and Coordination Act EMCA of 1999. We have an act over the environmental impact assessment mandated the NEMA to do so. The project proponent pays for the entire EIA process with a fee of 0.05% of the project cost. So, the goal of EIA is to promote environmentally sound development while balancing environment, cost, and benefit, and to avoid damage to historical, biological, archaeological, and aesthetical value. Whatever we do, whether it's industry or factory or urbanization, we have to assess what would be the impact on the environment, what would be the impact on the biodiversity, that we have to assess. And every industry have to take the environmental in EIA clearance from the um, EIA clearance from the ministry. So, considering its importance, approximately 180 countries have included EIA in the legislation as per the Morgan 2012 reports. So, we have already discussed the National Environmental Management Authority is responsible for the administering the environmental impact assessment, and for that there is an act, that is the Environmental Management and Coordination Act 1999, and the mandate the NEMA to do so. The project proposal pay for the entire EIA process while fee of 0.05% of the project cost. However, what is missing as part of EIA process is the impact assessment of important component, that is biodiversity. So when we talk about the EIA, what we are missing? We are missing the important component, that is the biodiversity. We are doing everything except assessing the biodiversity. So Brian and Trekwick in 2005 observed that biodiversity is often overshadows and largely ignored in most of the EIA work. So, biodiversity assessment is one of the very important components. Since we are discussing about the biodiversity types of conservation and all, so we have to take care of the biodiversity impact assessment. Impact assessment of biodiversity could be considered as an extension of existing impact assessment techniques that may help countries to meet the objective of sustainable development. So the development should be in a manner that the environment as well as the human or the urbanization both should be benefited. So BIA is defined as evaluation exercise which involve identifying, measuring, quantifying, valuing, and um, internalizing the unintended or development in interventions impact on biodiversity. Generally, biodiversity impact assessment is not a stand-alone assessment but an integral part of the EIA. BIA is not the BIA doesn't stand alone. It is the part of the EIA with explicit alternation and biodiversity impact. So biodiversity impact assessment, this picture itself showing at some places there's a green, at some places it's a brown, and some are fragmented. So biodiversity impact assessment would give extent of total habitat loss, how much we have lost, total habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, habitat degradation, and wildlife corridor restriction resulting destruction and displacement of the plants and animals. So whatever development we are taking, we are going to do, we have to do the assessment of the how much will be lost and what we will be benefited for. So would give extent of total habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, habitat degradation, and wildlife corridor restriction resulting destruction and displacement of the plants and animals. So habitat loss is important for the survival of the animals and including birds, everything. So habitat is one of the important component, and the corridor are the paths between the two forest patches, and they connect. Corridors are meant for the movement of the animals from one patch to another patch to avoid the impact of the fragmentation. The second is the factor considered for biodiversity impact assessment. So after introduction, come to the factor consideration for biodiversity impact assessment. There are two type of assessment: direct drivers of changes, changes in land use and land cover, fragmentation and isolation, extraction, harvest or removal of species, external inputs such as emission, effluents, disturbances, and introduction of invasive alien or genetically modified species restoration. So we direct driver of changes are the even the invasive species. If an invasive species is introducing in a habitat, it may create havoc. For example, in India, invasive species lantana camera was introduced, and now all the protected areas from North India to Central India up to the South India are infested with lantana camera, and lantana camera is are not palatable to the animals, so it is not good for the habitat, and this is the invasive species we discuss about. The second is the indirect drivers of changes. Indirect drivers of changes means demography. What was the demography, and after the establishment, what would be the demography, what would be the impact, what would be the changes, whether people have to shift from there, and or so this will come under the indirect drivers. Second is the economic. What would be the economy, socio-political, cultural, and technological process of intervention. So this all will come under the indirect drivers of the changes. So one was the direct driver. Direct driver means what will be the direct changes. Another is the indirect driver. Then assessment of impact. How we are going to assess the impact? So the impact can be assessed on the following aspect of the biodiversity, like composition of biodiversity. What is the composition of the biodiversity? How much and how abundant we have? In real time, impact assessment often does not go beyond the description of efforts on a species composition of higher plants and animal species. So we have to consider each and everything. Changes in population of keystone species are of particular relevance. Keystone species are those species which are important for a particular, for a kind of habitat. So uh, uh, keystone species or the indicator species, conservation of these species are very important for the conservation of the habitat. So composition of the biodiversity is first step we have to take while doing the assessment of the impact, and the second is the structure or pattern of biodiversity. What is the structure of biodiversity? So it is a spatial structure and a scale of the ecosystem in relation to the scale of the human intervention. Ecosystem scale refer to the space it occupy and the way it changes over the time. So structural or biodiversity, structure or pattern of biodiversity, the scale human intervention may be small in relation to the scale of the ecosystem or image. Ecosystem or large. So human intervention will impact at similar or larger scale are potentially more influential. The third is the food structure under the assessment of impact. The third is the food web structure. That is very important because introduction of the invasive species may create the havoc. And there are many examples. I have given a small example about the lantana camera in India. So changes in the food web have immediate repercussion for the uh, functioning of the entire ecosystem. For example, the introduction of the predatory non-indigenous Nile perch. Nile perch is a fish, is a carnivore fish, and basically it was introduced in Lake Victoria to ensure the food security for the people. People were collecting this and to use as a food. So non-indigenous Nile perch in Lake Victoria was introduced, and actually it upsets the entire ecosystem. Dozens of specialized fish species feeding on algae have been eradicated, leading to a turbid and locally deorganized lake. So this study was done in 1980, and it was monitored closely that yes, to ensure the food security, to provide the food to the people, the Nile perch was introduced, but actually it disturbed the whole ecosystem of the Lake Victoria. And the World Conservation Union invasive species specialist group said this is the Nile perch is one of the world's 100 worst invasive species. Invasive species are always not always bad. Some are good, but in this case they prove to be the worst because they remove all the indigenous species, they disturb the habitat, and there were lots of turbidity and deoxygenized lake. Lake was deoxygenized. So, what it could be the framework of biodiversity impact assessment? After assessing, we have to think about the framework of the biodiversity impact assessment. That is, impact assessment has to be started taking an ecosystem approach and involving relevant stakeholders, including local communities. So we cannot think of the conservation without the involvement of the local community. Involvement of the local community is very, very important because they are the stakeholder. They are not only the stakeholder, but they know their forest, their area very well. The people coming from making decision coming from outside we won't be able to do the justice as the locals can think and act on. So since biodiversity is influenced by cultural, social, economic, and biophysical factors, therefore cooperation between different specialists in the impact assessment team is thus essential. It is not one man job. It is not the man who is working on the birds or mammals can do. No, this process, the large project involved the social issues, the cultural issues, the economical issues, and biophysical factors. So we have to take the opinion. We have to consult with all these people so that we can prepare a framework for biodiversity impact assessment. If possible, quantify the changes in quality and amount of biodiversity. Explain the expected consequences of any biodiversity loss associated with the proposal. If we are going to establish some factories, if we are going to establish any big project, so we have to explain the expected consequences of any biodiversity loss, whether it's a cutting of the trees or removing of the habitat. So everything we have to explain. It is suggested to use national biodiversity strategies and action plan. So every when the convention of biodiversity took place in during at international convention, so every nation had to make their own strategies and action plans. So India started two things. One was the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plan, and another was the Biodiversity Act 2002. So National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plan was a mammoth exercise in which biodiversity of each and every area were documented. So we already have the documentation of the biodiversity. If you are going for the for the assessment or making the framework, we have to use the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, sub-national biodiversity plans, and other conservation report for information and the objective. We have to consult all these things because these are the documents, these are the government documents which are providing the present, providing this picture of the biodiversity values at that time when the assessment was taking place. Take into account cumulative threats and impact resulting either from repeated impact of project of the same or different nature over space and time, and or from proposed plan, program, or policies. So we have to take the help of the existing biodiversity plans. So, following are the steps for conducting BIA. For conducting the BIA, we have to follow the different steps like screening, scoping, and impact study. So, screening, what is screening? As name itself explains. So, biodiversity screening of impact assessment should include potential impact on PA, protected area, and area supporting protected species. Impact on other areas that are not protected but are important for biodiversity. Activities posing a particular threat to biodiversity and areas that provide important biodiversity services. So we have to take care of the importance of the biodiversity, whether it's a protected area or the non-protected area. So what would be the impact on the protected area or non-protected area? If we are starting any mining project, we have to take the clearance from the government of India, and we have to see the assessment of that project on the existing protected area, not only the protected area but also the around surrounding areas of the mining. Development of biodiversity screening map indicating important biodiversity value and ecosystem services. Integration of biodiversity screening map with the development of NBSAP, biodiversity planning at sub-national level, local authorities to identify conservation priority and target. So we have to involve all these people before establishing any industry, before establishing, converting the land use pattern. So all these we have to do while doing this. So this is the systematic approach to biodiversity issues in EIA modified after Brand 2020. So this is giving the EIA process, and this is the biodiversity consideration. So like EIA process is screening our adverse effect on the biodiversity likely. So like this we will be discussing all these in our lectures ahead. So scoping, after screening we have scoping. So scoping lead to term of reference of impact assessment. What are these scopes? Scoping is used as an opportunity to raise awareness of biodiversity conservation, biodiversity concerns, and discuss alternatives to avoid or minimize negative impact on biodiversity. So this is the scope. What all scope we have? If we have to establish something, what are the scopes? What we can work on? It is good practice to produce a scoping report for consultation. If you are doing something, some assessment, in case if it is mandatory, if it is important to do, to give the green signal for that project, then we have to find some scope. What are the scopes? How we can do? What are the alternative? So scoping should address the following issues: the type of project. What kind of project is that? Project, program, plan, or policy, possible alternates, and summary of activity like to affect biodiversity. So this we have to do to analyze all opportunities and constraint for biodiversity, including no net biodiversity loss or biodiversity restoration alternative. Whether we are going to lose the biodiversity or how we are going to restore the biodiversity. Expected biophysical changes. Biophysical changes in soil, water, air, flora, fauna. Suppose if we are establishing a factory, chemical factory, what effect it will be leaving on the soil, water, air, flora, fauna. So that we have to changes. Expected biophysical changes, what changes will take place resulting from proposed activity or induced by any socioeconomic changes. Spatial and temporal scales of influences, identification effect on connectivity between ecosystem and potential cumulative effect. So these all we have to see under the scoping is we have to address under the scoping and all. So, likely biodiversity impact associated with the proposal in terms of composition, structure, and function. These are the three main components. The composition, structure, and function. So, the biodiversity impact is associated with the composition, structure, and function. How it is going to impact these three biodiversity services and value identified in consultation with the stakeholders and anticipated changes in these biodiversity services. What all we are getting from the forest, what all we are getting from the surrounding environment. So that we have to um, list. So possible measure to avoid or minimize or compensate for significant biodiversity damage or loss, making reference to any legal requirement, information required to support decision making, and summary of important gaps. These we have to address while scoping. After screening scoping, we should go for impact study. We know what is the screening, what we have, what all we have. That is the screening. Scoping, what scope, what alternative we have. Now we should go for the impact study. If it takes place, if the project is developed, what would be the impact at the gene level, at the ecosystem level, and at the species level. So we have to see the impact we have to see the impact, what would be the impact of this particular project on gene, species, and ecosystem level. To what extent? At the gene level, we know gene is the basic unit of the life. To what extent will the project proposal have significant effect on genetic diversity of a species, particularly rare and declining species, and those with identified as priority in National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan and of sub-national biodiversity plans. Opportunity for species population to interact, for example, increase habitat fragmentation and isolation, and risk of extinction and persistence of locally adapted population. So these impacts we have to study at the gene level. So gene level means genetic diversity of species, particularly rare and declining species, those species. So all these we have to take care. And at the species level, the what extent will the proposal alter the species richness or species composition? If there are, suppose if there are mining activities, so what would be the impact on the distribution of the species, what would the impact on the composition of the species? So all this we have to take care, alter the species composition of communities, because if you develop something, there is always a change in the composition. Suppose when we go to the railway station, we see lots of columbali, we see lots of birds which has been adopted. The composition has totally changed. We have the birds at the railway station which are who have been adopted in that kind of environment. We hardly see sparrow and other species which are important. So these kind of thing we have to take care at the species level, what changes we are going to record. Changes are going to happen after species composition of communities, cause some species to be lost from the area, affect species identified as priority of NBSAPs and or subnational biodiversity plans, increase the risk of invasive by alien species. What if because of the establishment of that particular project, whether the what would be the composition of the species, and whether invasive species will replace the native species or not. So that all we have to take care. And then at the ecosystem level, to what extent will the proposal changes the amount, quality, or spatial organization of habitat, affect plans to enhance habitat quality or quantity, availability or quality, damage ecosystem process and services, are the opportunity to connect habitat or develop corridors. So these all we have to take care at the ecosystem level. And what are the mitigation of all these things? What are the mitigation of all these things? To impact assessment should give a precise description of the mitigation measure, how these will be implemented, a clear assessment of likely likely success of the proposed mitigation. Enhanced measures, remedial actions can take several forms like avoidance or prevention, mitigation. Suppose if we are doing something very important and something we are going to develop some project which is very important for our survival. So we have to be very careful if we can avoid the environmental damage, if we can alter the place, or so these kind of things we have to think. Any apply the positive planning approach. The whatever planning we are doing, we are it should always be the positive approach. The both should be benefited. We cannot directly say no. We have to think about our development also, development of the society, development of the urbanization and all these things. So the both the things should be benefited, the ecosystem, ecology, biodiversity, as well as the urbanization or the establishment of the factory, both these should be so we have to find out the midway. Review of the decision making, peer review of environmental reports with regards to biodiversity should be undertaken by a specialist with appropriate expertise where biodiversity impact are significant. If you think there is this area is will be having the significant biodiversity impact, so we have to consider all the document, all the expertise of the people to understand. Depending on the level of confidentiality of the public decision making, consideration should be given to the involvement of affected group and civil society. So the people who are living, the people who will be affected by this, they should be given the priority. Decision making, hollow conservation goal against development goals should be avoided. So balance conservation with sustainable use of economically viable and socially and ecologically sustainable solutions should be mandated. Therefore, for important biodiversity issues, precautionary measures should be applied. And management, monitoring, evaluation, and auditing. It is important to recognize that all prediction of biodiversity responses to disturbance is uncertain, especially over long time frame. Management system and program including clear management target and appropriate monitoring should be set in place to ensure that mitigation is effectively implemented. Unforeseen negative effects are detected and addressed. Monitoring the process of the project through the implementation and operative stage is crucial to ensure it is conducted appropriately. It is not that just before the project you do the evaluation and just finish. No, throughout the project there should be the impact assessment. Monitoring also identifies problem and help in correcting them before it becomes too late. So it is a continuous process. Auditing is essential for improving the BIA progress process. An audit also determine if BIA meets the CBD's objective. CBD is Convention on Biological Diversity. So conservation of diversity is also important. So BIA meets the CBD's objective, and if the process is capable of instituting changes in the path of human development. So all this we have to think. So apart from this, we have other technique to assess the biodiversity assessment is the remote sensing and the GIS. So information technology, use of remote sensing and GIS in biodiversity impact assessment. As we have done at the ground level, we can do by the saving the time. We can involve the GIS expert who can actually make the maps, overlay the maps, and finally decide what would be the impact. So this is the most advanced technique to assess the impact. Remote sensing and GIS overcome the limitation of conservation EIA and provide an unbiased, and easily interpretable EIA. Many studies based on BIA have indicated the usefulness of geospatial technologies in detecting the impact and determining the way to mitigate the problem. So many papers have been published, many workers has done on this. So GIS based approach is always good because it not only save the time but also it gives the very accurate data. So these are the application of spatial analysis and GIS in EIA, BIA process. This is the BIA process we just discussed, and this is the GIS process. So one is geospatial technique, another is the ground truthing. So remote sensing data available today, such as Iconos, QuickBirth, Lancet, Spotless, and Modis. These are the data bank which provide the data. If you want to take data, collect data from any area, you just go to these sites. They are available today, are useful for conducting BIA in the following way, like predicting vegetation cover loss following project implementation. We can always do the change detection using the vegetation cover. What was the vegetation? Because data for years and years is available on this. So if we collect the 10 years data, we can easily see what are the changes in the vegetation and what would be the change if we do this project. So that is the wonderful technique. Mapping environmental ecological sensitive areas or hotspots, selecting potential site for environmental restoration measure. Suppose if we have to do this project at a particular point, we have to always we have the alternative site for the environmental restoration. Preparing comprehensive thematic map for planners, decision makers, and environmentalists. We can always develop a thematic map on this thing, and we can also assess their impact. Monitoring and interpretation of baseline data. So assessing impact, especially cumulative impact, identifying and analyzing project alternatives, geographical location, site selection, overall design, and choices of technology. Environmental impact auditing provides a systematic approach for the collection of environmental information, makes the data used in EIA preparation accessible to all decision makers, and reduce the overall cost and institutional overlap in collecting and management of environmental information. So we have to work in with the consensus of all the institution involved so that there should not be the overlapping of the data. And the final conclusion of this BIA is that our dependency on biodiversity resources has caused its rapid depletion. The biodiversity loss is because of our dependency. We are totally dependent on the biodiversities for fuel, wood, fodder, timber, whatever you name, we are collecting from the environment. So our dependency on biodiversity resources has caused its rapid depletion, and with the industrialization, again we are removing the biodiversity. Nearly 170 countries around the world have come to the agreement that there is an urgent need to conserve, sustainable use, and impartially share biological resources. The contracting countries have agreed on the need to shift the path of human development so that these objectives could be met. It is time now to develop technique which deliver this shift. Environmental impact assessment is the process of assessing the impact of such development project on the environment. Whatever development project we are having in the area, the EIA is actually assessing the impact of such development project on the environment. That is the EIA. And environmental impact assessment alone are unable to affect the shift in the development path, or during most of the EIA work, biodiversity is often overshadowed, overlooked, or largely ignored. So those who are doing EIA, they are not much interested how many birds will be affected, how many plants will be affected, what would be the future of the mammals living in that area. So what would be the future of the plants, what kind of impact will be there. So that will come under the biodiversity impact assessment. So that we have to take under the BIA. It helps in evaluation exercise which involve identifying, measuring, quantifying and valuing the impact on biodiversity of development intervention. So these all the this is the conclusion we have to, before establishing any companies, any factories, any industry, we have to do the EIA and BIA. Biodiversity impact assessment is the integral part of the EIA. We just don't have to think about the hard this metallic pollution or these chemical this thing, but we have to think about the natural resource, about the natural resources, because we are totally dependent on the natural resources. What would be the future of the birds, plants, habitofauna, vegetation, mammals? You just name any biodiversity, what would be the future, what would be the impact, that we have to assess before starting any project. So that can be done through the BIA, and the latest technique is the remote sensing and the GIS. With this, I would like to end my talk, and we'll be meeting soon. Till then, thank you very much. And again, in my every talk, I always convey a message that we should do the plantation, and please, this monsoon, may, plant at least one tree. Thank you very much.